When people first learn about payment security, they often imagine the hardest part is protecting the card number itself. But the real trouble usually starts with how someone gets into the environment in the first place. Remote access is the doorway you use when you are not physically sitting in front of a computer, and administrative pathways are the special hallways that lead to the most powerful controls, like changing settings, creating accounts, and turning security tools on or off. Those two ideas combine into a single risk story. If a remote doorway connects directly to an administrator hallway, a mistake or a stolen credential can become a full takeover. The goal is not to ban remote work or make admins miserable, but to build safe paths that are predictable, limited, and hard to abuse. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain what remote access really is, why administrative access is different from regular access, and how to design a few hardened pathways that protect payment environments without relying on wishful thinking. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Remote access simply means using a network to reach a system from somewhere else, and it can include many situations that feel normal in everyday life. A student might remote into a school computer lab system from home, or a help desk worker might connect to a point-of-sale support server from a different building, or a vendor might connect to troubleshoot a payment application. The security problem is that remote access expands the boundary of trust, because you now have to worry about the device and network on the far end of the connection, not just the server you are connecting to. Attackers like remote access because it can be tested at scale, and because it often relies on a small number of shared entry points that are exposed to the internet. A beginner-friendly way to think about this is to imagine a building with a front door that is always watched, but then adding a side door behind the building that is sometimes left open for deliveries. Remote access can become that side door if it is not controlled and monitored in a consistent way. Administrative access is different because it can change reality inside the system rather than simply use the system. A normal user might read data, run an application, or submit a transaction, but an administrator can create new users, disable logging, change firewall rules, install software, and alter security settings that affect everyone else. That power makes administrative accounts a favorite target, and it also makes admin mistakes more damaging, even when nobody is being malicious. Another way to picture this is to compare someone who can rent a hotel room to someone who holds the master key that opens every room, changes the locks, and edits the guest list. In payment environments, administrative access often includes systems that route transactions, store sensitive authentication information, or manage encryption systems, so the impact of a compromise can be far larger than one machine. Because of that, hardened administrative pathways focus on reducing how often admin power is used, narrowing where it can be used from, and making sure it is strongly verified every time. A key idea that helps beginners is the concept of pathways, which is about the route taken, not just the destination. If an administrator can connect from any laptop, from any coffee shop network, at any hour, directly into a server that processes payments, then the pathway is wide and messy, even if the password is strong. A hardened pathway is a deliberate route with checkpoints, limits, and visibility, similar to how a secure building might require you to enter through one entrance, show identification, pass a guard station, and then use a separate badge to access a restricted floor. In technical terms, hardened pathways often include a small set of controlled entry systems, stronger identity checks, and network rules that prevent direct connections to the most sensitive assets. What matters is consistency, because security that is only sometimes used is not security. It is a suggestion that gets ignored under stress. When you design hardened pathways, you aim to make the safe path the normal path, so that emergency work does not automatically turn into risky work. Identity is the first checkpoint, and it has to be treated differently for remote access and administration than for ordinary daily tasks. In general, the farther you are from the system and the more power you are requesting, the stronger the identity proof needs to be. This is where multi-factor authentication, MFA, becomes a baseline expectation, because it reduces the chance that a stolen password alone can open the door. The important beginner point is that MFA is not magic, because attackers can still trick people into approving a login or steal session tokens, but it raises the cost and can block many basic attacks. Another piece is making sure administrative accounts are not used for normal browsing and email, because those everyday activities are common places where phishing and malware happen. When you separate accounts, the admin identity is exposed to fewer risky situations, and you can set stricter rules for it without breaking a person's ability to do their normal job. The next checkpoint is the device and the environment you are coming from, because remote access is not only about who you are, but also about what you are using. A hardened pathway often requires that administrative access comes from a managed device that follows security standards, such as having disk encryption, current updates, endpoint protection, and a lockdown configuration. The concept is called device trust in many environments, and it tries to answer the question of whether the connecting computer is likely to be safe enough to touch critical systems. From a beginner perspective, it is like allowing a mechanic to work on a race car only if they use tools from the official tool chest that is regularly inspected, rather than tools pulled from an unknown bag. If you allow administration from personal devices, you inherit unknown risk because you cannot easily prove that device is clean, updated, or protected. Hardened pathways reduce that uncertainty by narrowing the set of allowed devices and by checking their posture before granting access. Network location and exposure are also part of hardening, and this is where many environments go wrong by leaving a remote admin door directly reachable from the public internet. A safer approach is to place remote entry points behind additional protective layers, so that sensitive systems are not directly accessible even if someone knows their network address. This often means using a controlled gateway that accepts remote connections and then brokers access to internal systems, rather than letting users connect straight to the target servers. The gateway becomes the choke point where authentication, device checks, logging, and session controls can be enforced consistently. For beginners, think of it as having one guarded bridge into a city instead of many unguarded roads, because guarding one bridge well is easier than guarding 100 roads poorly. The hardening goal is not to hide systems through obscurity, but to reduce unnecessary exposure and force remote administrative traffic through a small number of heavily monitored routes. Privilege control is where the conversation shifts from getting in to what you are allowed to do once you are in. Least privilege means giving an identity only the permissions needed for the task at hand, and nothing more, which sounds simple, but is difficult if teams treat admin access as an all-or-nothing badge. Hardened administrative pathways support least privilege by encouraging role-based access, time-limited access, and just-in-time elevation. The beginner-friendly idea is that you should not carry the master key all day, and you should not be able to open every door just because you might someday need to. If someone needs to restart a service, they should not automatically get permission to change firewall rules or disable logging. When privileges are narrower, an attacker who steals an account gets a smaller set of capabilities, and mistakes become easier to contain. Session control is another layer that beginners often overlook, but it matters because remote access sessions can persist and become invisible over time. A hardened pathway should define how sessions start, how long they last, and what happens if someone is inactive or leaves a session open. Timeouts, re-authentication for sensitive actions, and forced disconnects help reduce the chance that a forgotten session becomes an open door. Recording or logging key administrative actions, especially those that change security posture, helps create accountability and makes investigations possible when something goes wrong. This is not about watching people to be punitive, but about building a record that can answer basic questions later, like who changed a rule and when it happened. Without session discipline, a remote admin pathway can quietly turn into a permanent tunnel that attackers can reuse once they gain a foothold. Segmentation is closely tied to hardened pathways because it limits where remote access traffic can go, even after successful authentication. If the payment environment is separated from general office networks and administrative networks are separated from user networks, then a compromise in one area has fewer chances to spread. Beginners can think of segmentation as putting fire doors inside a building, so that a fire in one area does not immediately engulf the whole structure. Remote access should land in a controlled zone first, and then specific, Approved connections should be allowed from that zone to specific targets, rather than giving broad reach across the environment. This approach also makes monitoring easier, because you can focus on a smaller set of known routes and detect abnormal connections more quickly. Hardened pathways and segmentation reinforce each other. One gives you a controlled entry, and the other ensures the entry does not lead everywhere. Monitoring and logging are what turn hardening from a set of rules into a living security control that can detect real problems. Remote administrative access should produce high-quality logs that show who connected, from where, to what system, and what they did at a meaningful level. You do not need to capture every keystroke to be effective, but you do need enough context to notice risky patterns, such as logins at strange hours, repeated failures, new devices, or access from unusual locations. Alerts should be tuned so that they are actionable, meaning they indicate something worth responding to rather than generating constant noise. For beginners, imagine a security camera that triggers an alarm every time a leaf moves, which quickly teaches everyone to ignore alarms. That is the opposite of actionable monitoring. A hardened pathway includes monitoring that people actually trust because it is specific, consistent, and connected to real response steps. A common misconception is that remote access hardening is mostly about picking the right technology, but the deeper issue is workflow and human behavior. If the secure pathway is slow, complicated, or unreliable, people will invent shortcuts, such as sharing accounts, leaving remote access enabled all the time, or connecting through unofficial tools that are not monitored. Hardened pathways need to be usable, because usability is a security requirement when humans are involved. That means the process for requesting access should be clear, the authentication steps should be consistent, and support teams should not be forced to choose between helping a customer and staying secure. It also means there should be a plan for emergencies, because real environments have outages and urgent fixes. A well-designed emergency pathway is still controlled and logged, even if it allows faster access with extra approvals, rather than silently bypassing security controls when pressure is high. Another misconception is that strong passwords alone are enough, especially when combined with a belief that an admin account is safe because only a few people know about it. Attackers do not need to guess the account exists if they can trick a person into handing over credentials or approving a login. Phishing, credential reuse from other sites, and malware that steals saved passwords are common ways attackers obtain access without breaking cryptography. That is why layered controls matter, including MFA, device checks, network restrictions, and monitoring. Beginners should also understand that vendor access is not automatically safer than internal access, because vendors can be targeted too, and their credentials can be stolen in the same ways. Hardened pathways treat every identity with power as a risk that must be managed, regardless of whether the person is an employee or a third party. It also helps to connect hardened administrative pathways to the idea of reducing attack surface, which is simply shrinking the number of ways something can be attacked. If only a small set of systems can accept remote administrative connections, and those systems are heavily protected and updated, then the attacker has fewer targets. If administrative actions must pass through a gateway that requires MFA and uses short-lived sessions, then a stolen password becomes less useful. If admin accounts are separate and rarely used, then suspicious use stands out more clearly and can be detected. For beginners, think of this as cleaning up a messy desk so that important documents are stored in a locked drawer, because fewer loose papers means fewer chances for something important to be lost or stolen. Attack surface reduction is not a single control, but the outcome of many small choices that narrow exposure and increase control. Finally, hardened pathways work best when they are backed by clear rules and regular review, because environments change and yesterday's safe pathway can become today's weak link. Teams add new systems, vendors change support models, people change roles, and remote work patterns shift, so access rules that are not revisited become outdated. Regular review means confirming who still needs administrative access, verifying that remote entry points are still required, and checking that logging and alerting still work as expected. It also means testing the pathway in a controlled way to make sure it is available during incidents, because a secure pathway that fails during a crisis will be bypassed. For beginners, the simple lesson is that security is not a one-time build. It is a set of habits that keep the safe route safe over time. When hardened administrative pathways are treated as part of normal operations, they become a reliable foundation for protecting payment data and reducing the chance that remote access becomes the easiest way for attackers to enter. A good way to wrap this up is to remember that remote access and administrative access are not inherently bad, but they are inherently powerful, which means they need more discipline than everyday computing. The safest environments make remote access predictable by funneling it through controlled entry points, verifying identity with strong checks like MFA, and limiting where a session can go once it begins. They make administrative work safer by separating admin identities, reducing privileges to what is needed, and recording enough activity to support accountability and investigation. They also keep the human side in mind by making the secure pathway usable, so that shortcuts do not become the real workflow. When you combine these ideas, you get hardened administrative pathways that are less about heroics and more about routine safety, where doing the right thing is simply the normal way to work. That is the mindset that supports PCI security goals and helps protect payment environments from the most common, most damaging kinds of intrusion.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.